The long road to Africa. US President Barack Obama finally turns his attention to the resource-rich continent. But is Washington trying to regain a position that it lost to China? And what can Africa expect from the United States? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. The US President and his family are heading to Africa, followed by an entourage of business leaders and security personnel. The Obamas will visit Senegal, South Africa and Tanzania for an official visit which will last almost a week. But the trip, costing the US taxpayer $100 million, is not without controversy. White House correspondent Patty Culhane reports.
There was dancing in the streets of Kenya when President Barack Obama was first elected. In his first year in office, he stopped in Ghana and said he understood this land. They shared blood. But that 22-hour visit was the last the African people have seen of him. Even White House officials say they haven't paid enough attention to the continent.
You've seen significant investments in Africa from China, Brazil, Turkey, and the U.S. would be ceding its leadership position in the world if the President of the United States was not deeply engaged in Africa. And that's what he's going to do.
The White House says the president wants to talk about aid, development, and democracy. But critics say his actions have shown what he really cares about: security and expanding the U.S. military presence in the region. Take a look at just the publicly named places where U.S. troops are now: Somalia, Yemen, Niger, Uganda, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Central African Republic, Libya, and Djibouti. In many places, they are there to train African troops. Activist Nia Kwete believes that's only going to create problems.
What is missing is teaching them respect for their civilian authorities so that they don't point guns at them because those are their commanders-in-chief, and also teaching them that the ordinary citizens are not to be abused, human rights respect.
He would like the president to focus on development during his three-country trip. There will be several stops where he is expected to tout his record on aid, but the facts show that his predecessor gave much more. Aid to Africa more than quadrupled during George W. Bush's presidency. In 2002, the U.S. gave $1.94 billion to the continent, but there was a rapid increase driven largely by President Bush's emergency plan for AIDS relief. By 2009, when President Barack Obama came into office, the amount the U.S. donated had risen to $8.24 billion. During the Obama presidency, the amount donated has actually decreased. In 2012, it's estimated the U.S. gave just over $7 billion. Most Americans, though, are focused less on what President Barack Obama is spending in Africa, but instead on what he's spending just to go there. The Washington Post reports the trip will cost taxpayers between $60 and $100 million. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, Obama's trip can hardly be called a comprehensive African tour. Out of 54 countries, he'll be visiting only 3. He is skipping Kenya. President Uhuru Kenyatta is indicted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague for crimes against humanity and its homeland of Obama's late father. Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, it was recently accused by the US of what it called human rights violations in its campaign against militias with an Islamic agenda. And Uganda, considered America's closest ally in the continent, with US assistance, it has been fighting al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Shabaab in Somalia. But Washington has criticized the Ugandan government over corruption and human rights abuses. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our 3 guests. From Pretoria, Matlotleng Matlou, Executive Director at Excelsior Afrika Consulting. From London, Alex Vines, Research Director and Head of Africa Program at Chatham House. And in Washington, D.C., Emira Woods, Co-Director of Foreign Policy at the Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome, all 3 of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Emira, I'm going to start off with you. You specialize in U.S. foreign policy in Africa, so you can possibly tell me, where's he been? Why has it taken him so long to get there?
Well, that's what many of us are saying. You know, the Obama administration put out a strategy document for Africa, but it came out in July of this past year. So, you know, it was the last year of his first term in office that a statement was put out, a strategy. And we wondered, well, what would have happened if the elections had been different? Why is it that it took so long to articulate a strategy for Africa from the Obama administration?
Look, he has been pretty busy, hasn't he? And he inherited a bad economy, a couple of wars that he's trying to withdraw from.
Without a doubt. There's clearly Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. The list is long of trouble spots around the world and issues needing the president's attention. But clearly what we have to underscore is that Africa is on the rise. Africa has over 1 billion people. It has a population base that is largely young people. You know, a quarter of the population is between the age of 10 and 24. It is a continent that is really moving forward in this 21st century. So I think it is incumbent upon the U.S. to get its policy right regarding Africa, to not only focus on the security sector, as has been the case under the Bush administration and again under the Obama administration, but really to look at how this dramatic economic rise in Africa can help meet the needs of the majority of people on the continent, deal with issues of inequality in addition to economic growth. These are the concerns people are demanding throughout the continent, not just for Africa's vast resources to be exported to the West or to China or to Brazil or India or any number of these countries that are now rising in their significance with Africa, but it has to move beyond oil, gas, mining, and land grabs. There has to be real attention paid to the people of the continent and their needs for value-added manufacturing, for decent jobs, for infrastructure that brings adequate and affordable health care and housing for all.
Okay. Alex, why do you think Obama feels that the time is right now to go to the continent and reconnect?
Well, look, you were right to point out in his previous term, he was very busy. The US economy, as well as the global one, was in meltdown in the West. All those wars that you mentioned, Afghanistan, the crisis in North Korea, Iran, all of those things, Syria, that distracted the Obama administration from a more robust Africa policy, which is what they had an ambition for. To give Obama credit, his Secretary of State for International Affairs, Hillary Clinton, traveled to more African countries than any other foreign secretary had before. So, you know, there were things that the Obama administration had done. But I think in the second term, the president will want to prioritize Africa further. And I think the key change from past policy will be this emphasis on private sector investment, that American companies will be looking for business opportunities, for foreign direct investment, but also for actually investing and building and constructing in Africa. A number of US firms now see great opportunities in the continent. So it's less about extraction of raw materials and particularly energy security, oil and gas out of Africa, and it's as much about investment and selling manufactured goods to Africa.
Okay, Matlotleng, South Africa, it's going to be the second stop of his trip. I mean, how do you as an African feel about him going there? Do you feel that he's overlooked you, and do you feel that your champion has let you down?
My view is that many Africans in 2008, when Obama became president, were very enthusiastic and happy that here was an African American becoming president, and not only an African American, but of the recent diaspora, with his father being from Kenya. But I think some of us said, look, he's a US president. I think we need to take that into account. And he's going to work basically for the interests of the United States. And I think if you look at foreign policy, he has gone to places where there's been a concentration by the US in places where, for them, China, for example, in terms of security and the economy, Europe certainly in terms of the economy, and the Middle East. I mean, you know, Israel has continued to receive huge amounts of aid from the United States. So I think there was nothing which was necessarily going to change in the US because you had an African American president. And I think for Africa, what we need to accept is that we are going to have to lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps and shouldn't wait for Obama and others to do that for us. I think China is a good example of a country that saw that it needed to do this, and China is taken seriously by the world because of what it has been able to do. Africa is going to need to do that, and I think the disappointment is that 50 years after the Organization of African Unity was formed, we're still talking about African unity. And one must also, be a bit skeptical about external parties who will have their own interests. So I think rather than argue about U.S. interests on the African continent, we should say, what are Africa's interests? And how can we ourselves make sure that we put those
a little bit
forward?
more about China. Let me pick up on the point that you raised, because while the U.S. has been pretty occupied in the Middle East and elsewhere, as you correctly stated, Matlotleng, China has built a political and economic foothold in Africa. China's direct investment has, in Africa, topped $15 billion over the past decade and is working on infrastructure projects like dams and airports across the continent. Its annual trade with Africa is around $200 billion, which is twice that of the United States. President Obama wants to promote trade with democratic countries, but China has been less picky and has traded without political strings attached. Not everybody is pleased about Chinese influence in Africa. Some say the mineral-hungry nation is exploiting Africa's natural resources. Alex, do you think it's correct that the US feels it's been overtaken by China?
US companies have been risk-averse to certain markets, partly because of this contradiction between values about democracy and human rights and interests. These have been blurred in places. If you look at a place like Equatorial Guinea, truly shocking human rights record there is. But who are the main players in the oil industry there? Well, it's Exxon and a number of companies like that who are busy there producing oil. So, the United States isn't that different in some markets than China. I think the issue is, though, that a lot of other companies from the US have been more risk-averse, more cautious about entering into the US market. That is changing now. Look, General Electric is much more present on the African continent than it was. Bechtel, it has been in Gabon. It's now expanding and quickly looking at market entry in other places. And that's what Africa needs. I think your other speakers are right. What Africa needs is diversified partnerships following through its own interests, and that means the US, as much as China, as much as former colonial powers like the United Kingdom or France, and other emerging or re-emerging powers like India, South Korea. So it's good that the president is going. It's good that there's a private sector emphasis. And of course, there will still be this tension between values and interests. That's always going to be the case. And I tend to believe that an emphasis on institution building and good governance is the way forward. And that is a distinguishing feature.
I'm going to pull Emira in here. I mean, the fact that the US can prove that it's rather looking out for the interests of African people, and that's one of the accusations that many Africans have against the Chinese, that they don't look after them.
Well, I think we have to, and I just want to continue where Alex began, because Alex pointed out Equatorial Guinea, and I think he was actually really right on point. But we have to understand, this has been a long-standing policy. You have U.S. oil companies that, for example, that have been in Nigeria since 1956 in the Niger Delta. U.S. and European oil companies have been very active steadily in spite of human rights violations over the decades, in spite of political turmoil over the decades. So, to kind of create this dichotomy between the U.S. and China is really a false dichotomy. I think both countries have looked to accessing resources and turned a blind eye to human rights violations when it suits their needs. So I think clearly we have to underscore that, for almost all the countries in the African continent, aid and trade have been surpassed by remittances. It is Africans, both on the continent and in the diaspora, that have been the drivers of their economies. So I think we have to put it in context. It will be those remittances that continue to flow into countries that help to uplift the standard of living of people within those countries much more effectively than both aid and trade, particularly trade that's been focused on the extractive sectors, has done.
Matlotleng, if we look at human rights abuses, not only from a trade point, a business point of view, but also a security point of view. I mean, the US is linked to many soldiers in Africa who have been linked to human rights abuses. If you look at those in Kenya, in Ethiopia, for example, some of the countries where the US has placed its drones.
Well, indeed, yes. I mean, I think, the two previous speakers have emphasized that the history of the United States on the African continent has not always been one where, in terms of human rights, they have upheld, the standards that we universally know in this area. I think, trade, security, oil interests, mineral resources, those have driven quite most of the U.S. policy. And of course, during the period of the Cold War, it was, an anti-communist stance, and particularly in Southern Africa. I mean, it took, many people to fight and lose their lives before, in 1986 or thereabout, President Reagan was forced, through vetoes in the House of Congress to impose sanctions on South Africa. So they saw, apartheid South Africa at that time. They saw these countries as bulwarks for so-called communism. And then I think this discussion by itself is a suggestion, almost in a patronizing way, that we're talking about Africa as if we're talking about, people who cannot, who are not adults or who cannot take care of themselves, that China, the United States, former colonial powers have to come and take care of African interests. And that is where the big problem is. I think the divide and rule and the weaknesses that we find amongst African countries have led to this situation. Otherwise, we should not have had situations like what happened in places like Ivory Coast, Libya, in the recent past.
Matlotleng, you brought up previous presidents who visited Africa, and it's a comparison that Obama may not be too pleased about when it comes to Africa. He's in the shadow of Bill Clinton and even George Bush. Critics of Obama point to Bush's program to combat HIV and AIDS in Africa. And as we just seen, in 2003, he committed $15 billion for 5 years, in effect, directly supporting antiretroviral treatment for more than 4 million people. Bush is also credited for starting the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a foreign aid agency that provided assistance to certain African countries. Before him, Clinton was the first US president to make more than one trip to Africa. He signed the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which dropped trade restrictions between the US and the continent. Clinton was also close to Nelson Mandela, providing support during South Africa's transition from white minority rule to its first free election in 1994. Emira, I want to pick up on Nelson Mandela. I mean, he is critically ill. Is this likely to overshadow Barack Obama's visit? And what is US policy as far as this sort of situation is concerned?
Well, I think the whole world, not just the U.S., but the whole world is waiting and praying and standing with the Mandela's family at this critical moment. I think it is a difficult time. President Mandela represents, not only for South Africa and Africa, but for the world, a leader, a visionary leader, focused on issues of justice, focused on issues of reconciliation, understanding the powerful role that leaders can play when they put forward a set of values that respect human dignity. So I think it's a difficult time, and I think there is concern for all those involved in President Obama's trip, that there be respect for the wishes of the family at this time. And I think the rest is sort of a wait and see in terms of understanding that we're all mortal, and that life must come to an end at a certain time. I think many of us, as we would with any loved one, would love to have them remain as long as possible with us. But we understand that that's not a reality.
I mean, Matlotleng, we know that President Obama initially wanted to meet with Nelson Mandela. I mean, there's no chance of that happening at all, and I should imagine it wouldn't go down too well in South Africa.
Indeed, yes. I mean, and interesting enough, this interview is actually taking place outside the Mediclinic Heart Hospital where he is. And of course, the huge media contingent out here. Yes, it's not going to be possible. Latest news is that he's in a very critical condition. And I think the family is beginning to accept that maybe That time is drawing upon us. I think South Africans are beginning to accept that, painful as it is. And indeed, I think importantly for us is how do we take the values that he would have stood for and try and let him live through those values. And I think the difficulties that we face in South Africa sometimes, mean that we've got to reflect upon this. Of course, his birthday is on the 18th of July, in less than a month to come. And, people keep saying we've got to look for those values, compassion. How do we treat others more kindly? How do we move forward as a nation in terms of trying to seek to unite this nation, but also certainly how does South Africa continue to play a more prominent role in terms of taking Africa forward together with our other African partners. And of course also a world in which, the values that he talks about, compassion, taking into account, the challenges that we face across the globe, and how do we use those values as a legacy to the man.
Okay, thanks for that, Matlotleng. Let's just talk a bit about how people in the US are responding to this trip. And as you can imagine, money is always an issue. They're pretty angry about how much the trip to Africa is costing. The one-week trip is expected to cost American taxpayers as much as $100 million, quite a bit more than former President Bill Clinton's trip to Africa in 1998. His bill came to around $42 million. President Obama and his wife will be travelling with an enormous entourage. They'll be joined by hundreds of Secret Service agents and staff. Military cargo planes will carry 56 vehicles, 56, including 14 limousines. And fighter jets will provide round-the-clock protection for the first family from the skies. Alex, I'm assuming that all of this is necessary.
Well, when a president comes anywhere in the world, it has a large entourage. So the cost of it doesn't alarm me so much. I do think it's a really important statement that the President of the United States, early in his second term, is visiting Africa. I think it's an important statement. It probably is a start of a more robust engagement. And, going to South Africa in particular, all three countries are important, but the visit to South Africa is truly important because the relationship between South Africa and the United States is a prickly, awkward one at the moment. It needs a good conversation between President Obama and his aides and the South African President Zuma to try and at least get a more common platform of understanding. South Africa is a G20 country. It is truly an important country with global ambitions, and a better partnership with the United States. There is a strategic dialogue is really essential. My regret is that the president isn't visiting Nigeria. Okay, there's human rights abuses in the north of Nigeria. It's a very serious situation there. But as you've said, Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa. And there needs to be a discussion of how to assist Nigeria to confront these global challenges. And the United States is an important partner amongst others. My fear is that President Goodluck Jonathan of Nigeria is increasingly isolated. He needs encouragement, support and partnership and discussion. And so worrying about the security of Nigeria might well have been the wrong call in my view.
Well, it seems evident that he needs to get back to Africa as soon as possible. There's been a rather, I must say, muted response that we've been getting on our Facebook page. Banira Raflat Ajore asks, how is this making the news? What difference does it make if he comes to Africa or not? Will his visit reduce poverty or unemployment? Will it change the level of corruption? Dejen Megersa adds that we Africans don't expect anything from the US and Obama. We can take care of ourselves. And Osama Rajkhan tells us Obama is visiting 3 promising countries with great future potential. So thank you then to my 3 guests, Matlotleng Matlou, Alex Vines and Emira Woods. And of course, thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want, you know that you can send your feedback by email to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching. From me, Jane Dutton, and the rest of the team, goodbye.